I don't usually take the bus at night, but that day, I had no other choice. I was exhausted after a long day at work, the kind that drains you completely, where all you want is to get home and collapse into bed. When I boarded the bus, it was nearly empty, just a few people scattered around. I took a seat near the middle, hoping to avoid the awkwardness of being too close to the driver or other passengers. I put in my earbuds, letting the quiet hum of the bus and the music lull me into a sort of half sleep. As the bus rolled through the dark streets, I felt a strange sense of calm. The familiar stops passed by, and I found myself staring out the window, watching the city lights blur as we moved. It was peaceful, in a way. Just me, the hum of the engine, and the faint lights outside. But then, something changed. One by one, the passengers started getting off. I didn't think much of it at first. People leave buses all the time. But when I looked up after what felt like a few minutes, I realized I was the only one left. Just me and the driver. That calm feeling I had earlier, it was gone, replaced by a tight knot in my stomach. I glanced at the driver through the rearview mirror, just for a second, but it was enough. He was staring right back at me. I quickly looked away, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just checking if there were any passengers left. Yeah, that had to be it. Still, I felt uneasy, like something was off. And then the bus took a turn. Not the usual one, the one that leads to my stop. No, this was different. My heart started pounding as I looked around, trying to figure out where we were going. I didn't recognize the streets. They were narrow, empty, with no other cars or people around. The buildings, what little there were, looked old, almost abandoned. I checked my phone, hoping to use the map, but there was no signal. Great. Now I was not only lost, but cut off from anyone who could help. I thought about saying something, asking the driver if he missed a turn, but the words stuck in my throat. What if he was just lost? What if I was overreacting? But what if I wasn't? My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Maybe he was taking a shortcut. Maybe he was new. Maybe... No. Something wasn't right. The bus kept going, deeper into this unfamiliar part of the city. The streets grew narrower, the buildings fewer. The driver still hadn't said a word, hadn't looked at me again, but I could feel the tension building. I felt like I was trapped, like the walls of the bus were closing in on me. My mind kept going back to that look in his eyes, that strange, cold stare. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I needed to know where we were going. My voice shook as I asked, "Are we going the right way?" He didn't answer right away. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me or was ignoring me. But then, without turning around, he said, "It's a new route." That was it. No explanation, no apology for the sudden detour. Just those 3 words, said in a tone that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking, my breathing too fast. I looked out the window again, but there was nothing to see. Just darkness and empty streets. The bus slowed down, and my heart jumped into my throat. We were approaching some kind of empty lot surrounded by trees. No buildings, no lights, nothing. Just isolation. My body went into panic mode. I needed to get out of there now. As the bus came to a stop, I sprang from my seat, not waiting for the doors to fully open before I jumped out. I hit the ground hard, nearly falling, but I didn't stop. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran, the cold night air burning my lungs. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the bus engine still running. I could feel his eyes on me, watching me as I fled into the night. My mind was racing, full of fear and adrenaline. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't focus on anything but getting away. But where was I going? The streets were empty, the area completely unfamiliar. Every shadow seemed to hide some threat. Every sound made me jump. I tried to find my bearings, but it was useless. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to find some kind of help before it was too late. I finally stopped when I reached a small, dimly lit road. I was out of breath, my whole body trembling. I looked around, hoping to see a house, a store, anything. But there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching into the darkness. I was alone, completely alone. I forced myself to keep walking, even though my legs felt like they could give out at any moment. I didn't know if he was following me, if he was still in that bus waiting, but I couldn't stop. I had to find a way out of this nightmare. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance, a car. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with fear. What if it wasn't safe? What if I didn't have a choice? I stood by the side of the road, waving my arms, praying that the driver would stop. The car slowed down, and I could barely breathe as it approached. I never saw the bus driver again. I never found out what his intentions were, why he took that detour, or what would have happened if I hadn't run. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere, waiting. I'm not sure where to start with this, but maybe writing it down will help me make sense of what's happening. I moved into this house about 2 months ago. It was a good deal, cheaper than anything else I found, and it seemed perfect for me. A small old house, a bit worn down, but with a charm that made me feel at home right away. The creaky floors and the old wooden cabinets added to the character. I thought it was just a place that had seen some years, maybe had a few stories of its own. But I didn't expect this. Last week, I was cleaning out the closet in my bedroom. It's one of those deep closets, the kind that feels more like a tiny room. I pushed some boxes aside to make room for more stuff when I noticed something odd. The wall in the back didn't look right. It wasn't flat like a normal wall. It had a small bump in the middle, like something was hidden behind it. Curious, I pressed on it, and to my surprise, the wall shifted slightly. I felt my heart skip a beat. I pushed a bit harder, and the panel moved, revealing a small compartment. Inside, there was a stack of letters tied together with a piece of string. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded but still readable. It felt like I'd stumbled upon someone's secret, something meant to be hidden forever. At first, I thought it was just old love letters or something harmless. But as I began to read, I realized these letters were not what I expected. The first letter was dated over 30 years ago. It was written by someone who clearly lived in this house before me. The writer talked about their days, how they spent hours alone in the house, how they loved the silence. But then, the letters took a strange turn. The writer started describing details about the house, like the exact number of steps from the bedroom to the kitchen, the creaks in the floorboards, the way the light came through the windows at different times of the day. It was unsettling, but not too alarming. Maybe they were just a lonely person, obsessed with the little details of their life here. But then I found a letter that mentioned a red chair in the corner of the living room. I froze. I have a red chair in that exact spot, one I brought in with me. The letter described how the chair stood out against the old wooden floor, how it made the room feel warmer. It was impossible. This person couldn't have known about my chair. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the previous owner had a similar chair in the same spot. But as I read more, the coincidences kept piling up. The letters began to mention things that only I could know, things that happened after I moved in. They described the way I rearranged the furniture, the time I left a book on the coffee table and forgot to put it back, the nights I stayed up late reading in bed. The writer knew things that were impossible for them to know. The more I read, the more my fear grew. The letters became darker, more obsessive. The writer talked about watching, waiting, knowing everything that happened in the house. They described my every move as if they were in the room with me. I started to feel sick, like someone was watching me even as I read those words. I stopped reading for a few days. I couldn't bear to see what else was in those letters. But every time I walked past the closet, I felt the pull of that hidden compartment, like it was calling me back. The fear gnawed at me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Finally, I gave in and read the last letter. It was dated only a few weeks ago, long after the house had been vacant, long after I'd moved in. The writer described the sound of my footsteps on the stairs, the way I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, the nights I tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. They knew everything. The final lines were scrawled in shaky handwriting, different from the rest of the letters. It said, "I've never left. I'm still here, watching." Panic gripped me. The thought that someone might be hiding in my house, watching me, was too much. I started hearing noises, faint rustling sounds in the walls, footsteps in the attic. But every time I searched, I found nothing. Last night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whatever, or whoever, was doing this. I stayed up late, listening, waiting for any sign of movement. But the house was silent, almost too quiet. This morning, I found a fresh letter in the hidden compartment. The ink was still wet, the words shaky and rushed. It described what I did last night, how I stayed awake, how I waited, how I looked terrified as I searched the house. The last sentence read, "I'm closer than you think. I don't know what to do. I can't stay here, but I'm too scared to leave. Every time I hear a noise, I jump. Every time I walk into a room, I expect to see someone standing there, watching me. I'm writing this because I don't know how much longer I can take this. If I disappear, if you never hear from me again, you'll know why. Someone is here, in this house, and they know everything about me." I woke up in a hospital bed, not knowing how I got there. The room was cold and too clean, the kind of clean that makes you uncomfortable. My head was bandaged, and I felt weak, like I hadn't moved in days. The only sound was the soft beeping of machines around me. I tried to remember what happened, but it was like hitting a wall. Nothing came to mind. No images, no memories, just a blank space where my thoughts should be. This emptiness scared me more than the pain in my head. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what. A nurse came in after a while. She looked nice enough, but there was something off about her smile, like it didn't reach her eyes. I asked her what had happened to me, why I was there. She told me I'd been in an accident, but when I asked for more details, she just smiled that same empty smile and said not to worry. She quickly changed the subject, asking if I needed anything to help me relax. I didn't want to relax. I wanted answers. But before I could ask more, she left the room, avoiding my gaze. Later, a doctor came in. He had a calm voice, too calm, and he kept telling me everything was fine, that I just needed rest. I pressed him for details about the accident, but he was just as vague as the nurse. His answers didn't add up. He was more focused on keeping me calm, like that was his main job, not treating whatever injuries I had. My suspicion grew with every word he spoke. It felt like they were hiding something from me, something big. As the days passed, I started noticing strange things around the hospital. The other patients in the hallway had this vacant look in their eyes, like they weren't really there. Some of them seemed to be in a daze, just staring at the walls or walking slowly, aimlessly. At night, the sounds in the hospital became even more unsettling. I'd hear distant cries, hurried footsteps, and once I heard the unmistakable clink of metal instruments. It didn't sound like the usual hospital noises, and it made my skin crawl. The staff continued to avoid my questions, and I started to feel like a prisoner, not a patient. No one had told me how long I had been there or when I could leave. The thought of being trapped in that place made my heart race. I decided to contact my family, but the phone in my room didn't work. I told a nurse about it, but she just smiled that same cold smile and said it was against hospital policy for patients to make calls. I asked if I could use another phone somewhere else, but she just shook her head and walked out. My sense of reality started to blur. Why couldn't I make a call? Why was everyone being so evasive? I began to wonder if I was really in a hospital at all. The walls seemed to close in on me as my fear grew. I overheard snippets of conversations between the staff, whispers about something they didn't want me to hear. The more I listened, the more I was convinced that this place was not what it seemed. Desperation set in. I had to get out of there. I waited until night, hoping that the hospital would be quieter, that I could slip out unnoticed. When the time felt right, I got out of bed, feeling dizzy and weak, but determined. The corridors were dimly lit, the kind of light that casts long, creepy shadows. I moved quickly, trying to stay silent, but every step echoed off the walls. Just when I thought I was close to finding an exit, I heard footsteps behind me. Before I could react, a group of orderlies grabbed me. I struggled, but they were too strong. They dragged me back to my room, ignoring my shouts and pleas. They held me down as one of them prepared a syringe. The needle pierced my skin, and a wave of calmness washed over me against my will. As my vision blurred, I noticed a dark figure watching from the end of the hall. It was someone I hadn't seen before, someone who seemed to be in control. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in the same bed, but this time I was restrained. Leather straps held my arms and legs down, preventing any movement. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't escape now, even if I tried. The door opened and a doctor walked in, but it wasn't the same one from before. This one looked different, more serious, less concerned with keeping up appearances. He stood by my bed, looking down at me with a cold, calculating expression. He finally told me the truth, or at least what he claimed was the truth. I wasn't a patient, he said, but a subject in an experiment. The hospital was just a front for something much darker, something they didn't want the outside world to know about. They had been erasing my memory repeatedly, trying to study something about the human brain, something I didn't fully understand. He explained it like it was just another day at work, no emotion in his voice. The more he talked, the more I realized I had no way out. I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. They had total control over me, my body, my mind, my memories. And the worst part? This wasn't the first time I'd tried to escape. According to the doctor, I had been through this same scenario over and over, always trying to get out, always failing. They would erase my memory again, and the cycle would start all over. I'd wake up in that same bed, with no memory of how I got there, and the horror would begin again. As he left the room, I felt the weight of the truth crush me. I was never leaving this place. This hospital, or whatever it was, had me, and there was nothing I could do about it. The beeping of the machine seemed louder now, like a countdown to when it would all start again. And the worst part? I knew that soon. I wouldn't even remember this conversation, this fear. They'd take it all away, and I'd be back at square one, waking up in confusion, trapped in a nightmare that had no end. The Night Visitor. It was one of those nights when the silence felt heavier than usual. The wind outside whispered through the trees, but inside my small house, everything was still. My daughter, Lily, was fast asleep in her room, and I was sitting on the edge of my bed, trying to unwind after a long day. Being a single mother isn't easy, but I've always done my best to protect her. The house is old, and the floors creak with every step, making it hard to ignore any sound that breaks the night's quiet. I was about to turn off the lamp when I heard it, soft noises coming from Lily's room. At first, I thought she was just moving in her sleep, maybe having a bad dream. But as I listened more closely, I noticed something strange. It wasn't just her shifting in bed. There was a whisper. The voice was too deep to be hers. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. Every instinct told me to get to her, to see what was happening. I got up quickly, my bare feet almost slipping on the wooden floor. The closer I got to her room, the clearer the whispers became, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. I pushed the door open, and my heart almost stopped. There, standing over Lily's bed, was a man I had never seen before. He was tall, his face barely visible in the dim light, but I could see the outline of a cold smile. Lily was still sleeping, unaware of the stranger towering over her. Panic hit me like a wave, but I couldn't let it take over. I had to protect my daughter. I demanded to know who he was, what he was doing in my house. My voice was shaking, but I tried to sound strong. The man didn't seem surprised. He turned slowly to face me, his smile not fading. "I'm her real father," he said calmly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The words made no sense. I knew Lily's father, and he was long gone. This man was a stranger. He didn't belong here, not near my child. I told him to leave, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside, I was terrified. How had he gotten in? What did he want? My mind was racing, searching for answers that wouldn't come. Instead of leaving, the man began to speak again. He told me things about Lily, things that only someone close to her would know. He talked about her favorite toy, a little stuffed bear she always slept with, and the way she would curl up on her side when she was tired. I felt the blood drain from my face as he spoke, my fear turning into a deep, paralyzing terror. How could he know these things? Who was this man? My thoughts were a mess, and I couldn't think straight. All I knew was that I had to get him away from her, but he was so calm, so sure of himself. It was like he had been planning this for a long time. My hands were trembling, and I took a step closer to Lily's bed, trying to place myself between her and this intruder. He didn't move, just kept watching me with that cold smile. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "I've been watching you both for a long time," he said. "I've been waiting for the right moment to take back what's mine." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. He had been watching us? How long? Why? I didn't know what to do. My legs felt weak, and my mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen in place. I thought about grabbing my phone, calling the police, but before I could move, he took a step toward the bed. That was when I lost it. I screamed, a sound full of fear and anger, and lunged at him, trying to push him away from Lily. We struggled, and I used every bit of strength I had, fueled by the need to protect my daughter. Somehow, I managed to push him out of the room. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely turn the key. I leaned against the door, breathing hard, my heart pounding in my chest. But it wasn't over. I could hear him outside the door, moving around the house. I ran to Lily's bed, trying to wake her up, but she didn't move. It was like she was in a deep, unnatural sleep. I shook her gently at first, then harder, but nothing worked. My mind was a mess, filled with fear and confusion. Why wasn't she waking up? What had he done to her? I could still hear him out there, somewhere in the house. Every creak, every footstep made my heart skip a beat. I didn't know where he was, what he was planning. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal with no way out. I sat on the floor next to Lily's bed, my back against the door, trying to stay calm. But I knew he was still there, somewhere in the dark, waiting. I didn't know what to do, how to keep her safe. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his presence, lurking in the shadows. I knew that the danger wasn't gone, that he was still out there, waiting for his chance to strike again. And all I could do was wait, listen, and hope that somehow we would survive until morning. It was just after midnight when my phone rang. The sound was loud in the quiet room, pulling me out of a restless sleep. I wasn't expecting any calls, especially not at this hour. When I looked at the screen, I didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer anyway. Maybe it was the thought of something bad happening. You don't get calls at midnight for good news. The voice on the other end was shaky, almost unrecognizable. But as soon as she said my name, I knew who it was. It was Marta, a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. We'd grown apart over time, no fight or drama, just life pulling us in different directions. But tonight, she sounded different, terrified. "You have to come," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, I need you. Come to the house now." I tried to ask her what was going on, but she just kept repeating the same thing, begging me to come. Then the line went dead. I stared at my phone, feeling a cold dread settle in my chest. Why was she calling me after all this time? And why did she sound so scared? I should have gone back to bed. That would have been the sensible thing to do. But something inside me wouldn't let me. I grabbed my keys and left the house, the night air biting against my skin as I got into my car. The drive to her place was long and silent. The streets were empty, the usual traffic lights blinking yellow. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I drove, my mind raced. I thought about Marta and the last time we'd spoken. She was always so full of life, always talking about her big plans. But something must have gone wrong. Why else would she call me out of the blue like this? Her house was on the outskirts of town, a place I hadn't been to in years. As I got closer, the roads became narrower, the trees thicker, their branches reaching over the road like twisted fingers. The darkness felt heavier here, pressing in on me from all sides. When I finally reached her house, I felt a jolt of shock. The place was dark, no lights on inside or out. The front door was slightly open, swinging gently in the wind. It looked abandoned, like no one had lived there for a long time. But I knew Marta lived here, or at least she used to. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, my heart pounding. I didn't want to go inside, but I had to. What if she was hurt? What if she needed my help? The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. I called out her name, but only silence answered me. The house smelled musty, like it had been closed up for a long time. Dust covered the furniture, and there were cobwebs in the corners. It didn't look like anyone had been here in years. I walked through the rooms, each step making the floorboards creak. I kept calling for her, hoping she would just appear and tell me it was all some kind of mistake. But there was nothing, just the emptiness of the house and the growing fear in my chest. In the living room, I found a broken phone on the floor, the screen shattered. Papers were scattered everywhere, but they didn't make any sense. Old bills, letters, some photographs. I picked one up, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of me and Marta, taken years ago. We were smiling, happy. But why was it here, among all this mess? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and there was a faint smell that I couldn't identify, something that made my stomach turn. Finally, I made my way to the basement. The door was heavy, and it groaned as I pushed it open. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The basement was dark, but I could make out shapes in the shadows, boxes, old furniture, and something else, something that made my skin crawl. As I got closer, I saw it. A dark stain on the concrete floor, and around it, signs of a struggle. Broken furniture, more scattered papers, and something else. A shoe, small and familiar. It was Marta's. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. What had happened here? My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. Had she been hurt? Taken? But by who? And why had she called me? I started to doubt everything. Had I imagined the call? Was this some kind of sick joke? Just as I was about to turn and run, my phone rang again. The sound was so loud in the silence that I nearly dropped it. I fumbled to answer, my hands shaking. It was Marta's number, the same one that had called me before. But this time, her voice was different. It was calm, too calm, like she was no longer afraid. She told me to go home, to forget everything I'd seen, to never come back. Her words sent a chill down my spine. How could she know what I'd seen? As she spoke, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The call was coming from my own phone. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, bolting up the stairs and out of the house. The night air hit me like a slap, and I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. My hands were trembling as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get away from that house, from whatever had happened there. I don't know what really happened that night. Maybe I never will. All I know is that something terrible happened in that house, something involving Marta. I haven't heard from her since. Part of me wonders if she's even still alive, but I can't bring myself to go back and find out. Some things are better left unknown. I woke up to an empty bed. My first thought was that she'd gone to the kitchen, but the silence in the house was too heavy. There wasn't the usual sound of the coffee machine or her light footsteps on the wooden floor. I called her name. Nothing. I got up, looked around, and found a note on the kitchen counter. It was simple, just 2 words. I'm sorry. That was it. No explanation, no clue. Just those words written in her neat handwriting. My stomach tightened, and 100 thoughts ran through my mind. Was she in danger? Was she leaving me? None of it made sense. I needed to understand what was happening, so I started searching the house, hoping to find some answers. The first place I checked was our bedroom. I tore through drawers, cabinets, even under the bed. It was during this frantic search that I stumbled upon something strange. In the back of her closet, hidden beneath a pile of old clothes, I found a small locked drawer. I had never noticed it before. With some effort, I forced it open, and what I found inside was confusing. There was a second phone, one I'd never seen before. There was also a journal, but it was locked with a tiny padlock and several receipts from places I didn't recognize. Hotels, restaurants, all in parts of the city we never visited together. My heart pounded as I realized how little I knew about the woman I thought I loved. I sat on the bed, the second phone in one hand, the journal in the other. I didn't know what to do first, but I knew I had to find out more. I powered on the phone. It didn't ask for a password, and the screen came to life. The messages and call logs were a mystery, full of names I didn't recognize. One message, sent late last night, caught my eye. It simply read, "Meet me at the cabin. We need to talk." I felt a chill run down my spine. What cabin? We didn't own one, and as far as I knew, neither did she. The location was in the middle of nowhere, miles away from our home. Why was she meeting someone there? I couldn't stop myself. I had to follow this lead, even though every part of me screamed that I shouldn't. I grabbed my keys, slipped on my shoes, and drove. The drive was long, and as I left the city behind, my mind raced with possibilities. Maybe she was in trouble. Maybe she had a life outside of ours, something dark and hidden. I didn't know what to expect, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know the truth. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked abandoned. It was small, made of old wood, with windows covered in dust and grime. I hesitated, wondering if I should even go inside. But the thought of her, alone, maybe scared, pushed me forward. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood and something else. Something metallic. My hands shook as I stepped inside, and what I found only deepened my fear. The walls were covered in photographs, all of them of my wife, but in places I didn't know, with people I didn't recognize. Some showed her smiling, others were different. She looked afraid in some, angry in others, and in all of them, she was a person I didn't know. On a small table in the corner, I found more documents, papers that suggested she was involved in something dangerous. The words were technical, some in languages I didn't understand, but it was clear they weren't something she should have been involved with. I didn't know what any of it meant, but it was bad, really bad. Then I heard it. Footsteps outside the cabin. Someone was there, and they were coming closer. My heart raced as I quickly searched for something to defend myself with. I grabbed a heavy old candlestick from the table and moved toward the door. The footsteps stopped, and the door slowly opened. A man stood there, tall, with a face that was both familiar and unknown at the same time. He looked at me, then at the photographs on the walls. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice calm but filled with something I couldn't place. "She didn't want you to find this." "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you know about my wife?" He stepped inside, looking around as if he belonged there. "Your wife was hiding from something. Someone. She thought you'd be safe if you didn't know. But you found out anyway, didn't you?" I didn't know how to respond. I wanted answers, but I also wanted to run. The man walked over to the photographs, touching one with a sad expression. "She wasn't who you thought she was, but she tried to protect you. That's why she left." I felt my world collapsing. Everything I knew was a lie, and now this stranger was telling me things I couldn't understand. "What did she do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me with pity. "It's better if you don't know. Go home. Forget all of this." And then, just like that, he turned and left, disappearing into the woods as if he had never been there. I was left alone in the cabin, surrounded by the remnants of a life I didn't understand. I drove home in a daze, her note clutched in my hand. I didn't know what to do, what to think. My wife was gone, and with her, everything I thought I knew. I sat in the dark, staring at the note, wondering if I should keep searching for her or let her go. I'll never know if I made the right choice, but I do know this. Sometimes, the truth is more terrifying than any lie. I needed to clear my mind. The day had been heavy, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Work had been stressful, and on top of that, an argument with my boyfriend had left me feeling restless. I couldn't stay inside, so I decided to go for a walk, hoping the cool night air would calm me down. It was late, past midnight, and the neighborhood was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels almost unnatural, like the world has paused. The only sounds were the distant hum of cars on the main road and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, giving everything a soft, yellow glow. At first, I walked slowly, letting my mind wander. The air was crisp, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, enjoying the way the cold bit at my cheeks. I took deep breaths, feeling a little bit of the tension start to leave my body. But as I walked further from my house, something strange started to happen. The first street light I passed flickered as I walked under it. I didn't think much of it. Old lights do that sometimes. But then the next light also flickered and went out as I got close. This time, it made me pause. I looked up at the light, now dark, and then around me at the other lights on the street. They were still on, casting their faint glow over the empty road. I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe a power issue in the neighborhood. I kept walking, but now I was more aware of my surroundings. Each step felt heavier, and my breathing started to quicken, matching the growing unease in my chest. Then, as I approached the next streetlight, it happened again. The light flickered and went out just as I was about to walk beneath it. I stopped in my tracks, my heart thudding in my chest. I looked back at the path I had come from, now mostly dark, with only a few lights still on in the distance. A chill ran down my spine, and I decided it was time to turn back. But as I did, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were soft at first, almost like they were trying not to be heard. But they were there, echoing in the silence of the night. I froze, my ears straining to catch the sound. The footsteps were coming from behind me, slowly but steadily getting closer. I turned around quickly, my eyes scanning the street, but there was nothing. Just the dark, empty road stretching out in front of me. My breath hitched in my throat and I started walking again, faster this time. But the footsteps behind me matched my pace, always staying just far enough away that I couldn't see who or what was making them. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the echo of my own steps was playing tricks on me. But the fear gnawing at my gut told me otherwise. I was almost running now, my shoes slapping against the pavement, but the footsteps behind me kept coming, faster and louder. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel sweat starting to bead on my forehead despite the cold. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but I was afraid that if I made a sound, whatever was behind me would catch me. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, my eyes wide with terror, but the street behind me was empty. Yet the footsteps were there, so close now that it felt like they were right on top of me. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I ran, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. The streetlights ahead of me began to flicker, one by one, as if they were going out just for me. The darkness swallowed me whole, and the sound of the footsteps suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I slowed down, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath, every instinct screaming at me to keep going. But I didn't. Instead, I turned around, one last time, praying that I wouldn't see anything. But I did. Standing in the middle of the road, a few feet away, was a shadowy figure. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person watching me. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me as I realized I had been followed all along. For a moment, I was paralyzed, my mind racing as I tried to think of what to do. Run? Scream? But my body refused to move, rooted to the spot as the figure just stood there, not moving, not making a sound. It was like they were waiting for something, or maybe just enjoying the fear that was twisting inside me. Finally, my legs started working again, and I stumbled backward, turning around and running as fast as I could toward the nearest house with its porch light still on. I reached the light, panting and out of breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked back, expecting to see the figure right behind me, but the street was empty. but the fear didn't leave me. I knew, deep down, that whoever or whatever that figure was, they weren't gone. They were still there, lurking in the darkness, waiting. The lights might have given me a temporary refuge, but I could feel the eyes watching me from the shadows, the presence waiting just out of sight. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe walking at night again. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I keep looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing just outside the circle of light. I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being followed, that no matter where I go, the darkness will always be there, waiting to swallow me whole. I'm not the kind of person who falls for scams. So, when I got this letter in the mail, claiming I had been chosen for a once-in-a-lifetime experience, I didn't think twice about it. The paper was thick, the writing neat, almost too perfect. They even used my full name. It was like they knew me, but I was sure it was just some elaborate marketing ploy. I crumpled it up and tossed it into the trash without a second thought. Life went on. Work, home, the usual. But about 3 days later, things started getting weird. At first I didn't notice it much. Just a guy at the grocery store, standing too close, staring at me. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. I mean, it's a free country. People can look wherever they want, right? But then it happened again, and again. Different guys, different places, but always the same thing. Intense, unsettling stares that seemed to follow me wherever I went. It was when I saw one of them outside my apartment building that I started to freak out. He was just standing there, leaning against a lamppost, not doing anything, not even looking directly at me. But I knew he was there for me. I rushed inside, heart pounding, hoping he wouldn't follow. For a while, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I'd tell myself, "You're overreacting, it's just coincidence." But that didn't help. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. I started seeing these men more often, in places they had no reason to be. They didn't try to hide it. They wanted me to know they were watching. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to find another letter slipped under my door. This one was different. No fancy paper, no neat handwriting. It was just a plain piece of paper with a typed message. "You're running out of time to accept the experience." My hands shook as I read it, my mind racing. Was this some kind of sick joke? I tried to think of anyone who might be messing with me, but nothing made sense. I didn't have enemies. I barely had friends. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those men outside, waiting, watching. I kept checking the windows, expecting to see them standing there, but they weren't. The silence was almost worse. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay in the city anymore. I had to get away, far away. I packed a bag and booked a last-minute bus ticket to a small town several hours away. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I figured if I disappeared, they wouldn't be able to follow, but I was wrong. The bus ride was tense, every stop feeling like a trap. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see one of them boarding the bus, but it wasn't until I reached the town that I saw them again. They were waiting at the station, like they knew I would be there. 2 men, one tall, the other short, both wearing dark clothes. They didn't approach me, just stood there, making sure I saw them. My stomach dropped. I left the station, walking as fast as I could without running. I didn't know where I was going, just away. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were just a step behind. Every corner I turned, every alley I passed, I felt their presence, even when I couldn't see them. Finally, I stopped in an old run-down hotel on the edge of town. I didn't care about the state of the place. I just needed a room with a lock. Inside, I sat on the bed, clutching the bag I had packed, and tried to calm down. But I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't run forever. That night, there was a knock on my door. I froze, my heart racing. I didn't answer, hoping whoever it was would go away. But the knocking continued, slow, deliberate. "You can't hide from this," a voice said from the other side of the door. "You signed up for it. Now it's time." I didn't remember signing up for anything, but the certainty in the voice made me doubt myself. Had I done something I couldn't remember? Something that led to this nightmare? Desperate, I looked around the room for anything I could use as a weapon. There was nothing. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence. I waited, terrified, expecting them to break down the door at any moment. But instead, an envelope was slipped under the door. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message. "It's not a choice. It's a promise." I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. This was real. They weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted, whatever that was. I was trapped, with no way out. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. Running wasn't an option anymore. I had to face them, find out what this experience was, and why they were so determined to make me part of it. I left the hotel and walked back to the bus station, expecting to see them there. But the station was empty. For the first time in days, I was alone. I almost felt relieved until I noticed a car parked across the street. The men were inside, waiting. I walked up to the car, my heart pounding. They rolled down the window, and I saw their cold, expressionless faces. "Ready for the experience?" one of them asked. I nodded, my throat dry. I didn't know what would happen next, but I was too tired to care. Whatever this was, it had already taken over my life. I just wanted it to end. They opened the door and I got in, the dread settling in my stomach like a stone. As the car pulled away, I realized that I might never know what this experience really was. All I knew was that I was no longer in control. I woke up with a start, feeling a cold draft on my face. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The room felt wrong. The hairs on my arms stood up as I realized what was bothering me. The front door was wide open. I had locked it last night. I was sure of it. I always double-check. But there it was, open like an invitation, the darkness from the hallway spilling into my living room. My heart started pounding as I got out of bed, my mind racing. Had someone broken in? But why would they leave the door open? I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but my hands were shaking so much that I nearly dropped it. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who would I call at this hour? I was alone, and the only thing I could think of was to check the security footage. I had installed a small camera in the hallway a few months ago after some packages went missing. It wasn't much, but it gave me a sense of safety. I fumbled with the app on my phone, scrolling back to the footage from last night. I found the recording from around 2 a.m. The screen showed me, dressed in my pajamas, calmly walking out of my apartment. My blood ran cold. I had no memory of this, no memory of getting out of bed. No memory of unlocking the door, nothing. It was like watching a stranger wearing my skin. I watched myself disappear into the hallway, the door closing behind me. I fast-forwarded the footage, my fingers trembling. About an hour later, I saw myself coming back. But something was wrong. The person in the footage moved slowly, deliberately. She, or rather I, paused just before opening the door, glancing around like she was making sure no one was watching. Then she slipped back inside, closing the door quietly, almost too quietly. I felt sick to my stomach watching it. I must have stood there for a good 10 minutes, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I had no memory of leaving or coming back. It was like someone else had taken over my body for that hour. The thought crossed my mind that maybe I had been sleepwalking, but it didn't make sense. I had never sleepwalked in my life, and even if I had, why couldn't I remember anything? I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to figure out what happened. I started checking my apartment. Everything seemed normal at first, but then I noticed small things that were off. The chair by the window had been moved slightly, just enough that it wasn't in its usual place. My phone, which I always kept by my bed, was on the kitchen counter. I tried to remember putting it there, but my mind was blank. My shoes were by the door, but they had dirt on them, like I had walked outside. I touched the soles, feeling the roughness of dried mud. Where had I gone? And why couldn't I remember? My thoughts were a jumbled mess. The more I tried to remember, the more my head hurt. I sat down on the couch, my heart still racing. I needed to know. I opened the security footage again, this time looking more closely. That's when I saw it. As I rewatched the footage of my return, something caught my eye. A shadow just at the edge of the frame, near the stairwell. It was there, barely visible, but it was definitely there. Someone had been waiting in the shadows. I could see a faint outline, a figure standing still as I walked back to my apartment. My blood froze. I hadn't been alone. Someone had been out there, watching me. My mind raced with questions. Who was it? Why were they there? Had they followed me back inside? I tried to think of what to do next. Call the police? But what would I say? That I saw a shadow on the camera? That I had walked out of my apartment without remembering it? They'd think I was crazy. I kept staring at the screen, my eyes fixed on that shadow. It didn't move, didn't come closer, but the fact that it was there, that someone was watching me, made my skin crawl. What if they were still out there? The thought made me jump up from the couch. I checked the door again, making sure it was locked, then double-checked all the windows. Everything was secure, but I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel alone. I kept thinking about that missing hour, about where I had gone and what I had done. Why couldn't I remember? And who had been waiting for me to come back? I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the couch, my back to the wall, my eyes fixed on the door. Every little sound made me jump. Every creak in the floorboard sent a shiver down my spine. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the curtains, I felt a small wave of relief. But the fear was still there, lurking in the back of my mind. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to. I just knew that something was very, very wrong. And I was afraid that whatever had happened that night wasn't over, that whoever had been out there in the shadows was still waiting. I kept thinking about that shadow, about how close it had been. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't know what happened that night, and I don't know if I'll ever find out. But I do know one thing. I'm not safe in my own home anymore, and that's the scariest part of all. I've worked the night shift for years. The hospital is quieter then, almost peaceful, but there's always something unsettling about the silence. The dim lights and empty halls make it feel like a different place entirely, like a place that hides secrets in the shadows. My nights are usually routine, checking on patients, administering meds, writing reports. It's repetitive, but that's what makes it safe. I know every corner, every sound. The occasional creak of the old building settling, the distant hum of the machines. None of it surprises me anymore. Or at least, it didn't. One night, as I did my rounds, I noticed something strange. A patient's room was empty. At first, I thought maybe they'd been moved, but when I checked the records, there was nothing. No transfer, no discharge, no note. It was like they'd just vanished. I asked a few of my colleagues, but they didn't seem to care. One shrugged, saying it must have been a mistake in the system. Another looked at me like I was overreacting. "Don't worry about it," they said. "These things happen." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My gut told me this wasn't just a mistake. Over the next few nights, it happened again. Another patient gone. No record of where they went. Then another. Each time, the response from my colleagues was the same: indifference, a brush off. It was like no one else saw what I did, or maybe they just didn't want to see it. I started to feel like I was the only one who cared, the only one who noticed. I began paying closer attention, looking for anything out of place, and I found it. Odd stains on the floors of the empty rooms, like something had been dragged across the floor. And the staff, they were acting different, quieter, more secretive. I overheard hushed conversations in break rooms, saw quick glances exchanged between doctors and nurses. They were hiding something, but what? I couldn't let it go. I started staying late, walking through parts of the hospital I usually avoided. One night, I found an old elevator tucked away at the end of a long, dark hallway. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The buttons were worn, and the doors creaked as they opened. I don't know why, but I stepped inside and pressed the button for the basement. The ride down felt like it took forever. When the doors finally opened, I was greeted by a cold, stale air. The basement was dark, only a few dim lights flickering on as I stepped out of the elevator. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I kept going, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The basement was like a different world. Old equipment, dusty and forgotten, lined the walls. The further I went, the more I felt like I was trespassing, like I wasn't supposed to be there. And then I heard it. A faint sound, like a moan, coming from behind a heavy metal door at the end of the corridor. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that as soon as I touched the handle, but I couldn't stop myself. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with dim, red light. And there, strapped to tables, were the patients who had gone missing. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to process what I was seeing. The patients were alive, but barely. Tubes ran from their bodies to strange machines, and their skin was pale, almost gray. They looked like they were being drained, used for something I couldn't understand. I felt sick, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the horror in front of me. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a group of doctors and nurses standing in the doorway, their faces cold and emotionless. One of them stepped forward, a syringe in hand. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran as fast as I could, back through the basement, up the stairs, into the labyrinth of hospital corridors. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps echoing through the halls. My mind raced with panic. How had I not seen this before? How deep did this go? And more importantly, how was I going to get out of this alive? I finally made it to the main floor, but it was empty. The night shift was quiet as always, but now it felt wrong, like a trap. I headed for the exit, but the doors wouldn't open. Locked. Trapped. I turned to find another way, but the doctors were already there, blocking my path. There was no escape. I knew that then. They closed in on me, and I backed away until I hit the wall. The last thing I remember is the syringe in the doctor's hand, the needle glinting in the dim light. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, but not in the same hospital. This one was different, older, more run down. My head was foggy, and I couldn't move. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I could see the same doctor standing by the door, watching me. They don't let me leave. I'm not sure if I'm alive or dead, if this is real or a nightmare I can't wake up from. All I know is that I'm trapped here, just like the others. And soon, I'll disappear too. It started with a note in my mailbox, just a few words scribbled on a piece of paper. Be careful. Danger is closer than you think. I remember standing there staring at it, feeling a strange mix of confusion and unease. It felt like a joke, but it wasn't funny. I crumpled it up, tossing it in the trash without a second thought. I didn't know then that this was only the beginning. A few days later, another note appeared. This one wasn't vague like the first. It said, "You leave your house at 7:30 a.m. every day. Someone is watching." That hit me differently. It wasn't a generic warning. It was specific, too specific. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone at work was messing with me. But who and why? I started feeling a bit paranoid, looking over my shoulder whenever I left the house. The notes kept coming, each one more detailed than the last. They knew everything: where I bought my coffee, the exact time I arrived at work, who I talked to during lunch breaks. It was like someone had a front row seat to my life, and they were enjoying making me squirm. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself it was all a weird coincidence or some elaborate prank. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. One morning, I found a note that mentioned Sarah, a friend I often saw at the cafe near my office. It described our last conversation, word for word. I hadn't told anyone about that talk. I remember reading the note, my hands shaking, as the reality of the situation started to sink in. Someone close to me was doing this, someone I trusted. I began looking at everyone differently, my friends, my neighbors, even the barista at the cafe. Each time I talked to someone, I wondered if they were the one. Were they hiding something behind their smiles? Every interaction felt like a test, every conversation a trap. I started avoiding people, withdrawing into myself, unsure of who I could trust. But the notes didn't stop. They got bolder, more direct. "Your friend knows more than you think," one said. Another read, "Ask him about last Tuesday." My mind immediately went to Mark, my best friend. We had met for drinks the previous Tuesday, and I couldn't recall anything unusual about our conversation. But now, I wondered if there was something I had missed. Confronting Mark was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I invited him over, trying to act normal, but inside, I was a wreck. As we talked, I watched his every move, listened to his every word, looking for signs of deceit. Finally, I brought it up casually, asking if he had noticed anything strange lately. He seemed genuinely confused, even concerned for me. But when I mentioned the notes, his face changed. For a brief moment, I saw something. Fear? Guilt? I couldn't be sure. He quickly denied knowing anything about them, but the seed of doubt was planted. I didn't know what to believe anymore. After Mark left, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying our conversation, wondering if I was being paranoid, or if there really was something he wasn't telling me. The next morning, I decided to investigate on my own. I started retracing my steps, paying close attention to my surroundings, looking for anything out of place. I even checked my house for hidden cameras or microphones, but found nothing. The lack of answers only made me more anxious. The notes, however, kept coming. They no longer felt like warnings, they were threats. "You won't make it to work tomorrow," one read. Another simply said, "Run." The sense of dread that had been building up over the past weeks was now overwhelming. I felt trapped, constantly on edge, waiting for something terrible to happen. Then came the final note. It was in my mailbox, just like all the others, but this one was different. It was addressed directly to me, using my name. The handwriting was the same, but the words sent a chill down my spine. "You know who I am? I'm waiting." I read those words over and over, trying to make sense of them. Who was it? Someone close, that much was clear. Someone who knew everything about me, who had been watching, waiting for the right moment. But who? My mind raced through the possibilities again, but this time, one name stood out: Mark. I don't know what pushed me to his door that night. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe I just needed to confront my fears. The street was quiet, almost eerily so, as I stood outside his house, the final note clutched in my hand. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, as I reached for the doorbell. But before I could press it, the door opened. There he was, standing in the doorway, looking surprised to see me. Or maybe it wasn't surprise. Maybe it was something else, something darker. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been waiting," he said softly. That was it. That's where the story ends. I wish I could tell you what happened next, but I can't. I don't remember, or maybe I just don't want to. All I know is that I'm not the same person I was before. I don't trust anyone anymore. And I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. When I found the room on Craigslist, it seemed like a blessing. I had just moved to the city for a new job, and finding a place to live on a tight budget was hard. The ad for a cheap, fully furnished room caught my eye. The landlord, Mr. Green, was an older man, quiet and polite. The house was old but clean, and the room, though small, was cozy. The price was almost too good to be true, but I needed to save money. I felt a bit uneasy around Mr. Green. There was something off about him, but I ignored it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Moving in was quick. I didn't have much, just a suitcase and a few boxes. As I unpacked, I noticed a few odd things. The room was filled with random decorations, old picture frames, vases, and knickknacks. They seemed out of place in such a small room, but I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to settle in and get some rest before my first day at work. It wasn't until the next evening that things took a strange turn. I was unpacking a box on the small table in the corner when I accidentally knocked over a picture frame. It fell to the floor and the back popped open. That's when I saw it. A small black device hidden inside the frame. It was a camera. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the camera, trying to make sense of it. Why would there be a camera in my room? I started looking around, and suddenly, everything felt wrong. I inspected the room more carefully, checking every object. The more I looked, the more cameras I found. They were hidden in places I would never have thought to check. Inside the clock, behind the bookshelf, even in the vent above the bed. It felt like someone had been watching me all this time. I panicked. My first instinct was to get out of there. I grabbed my phone and wallet and headed for the door. But when I turned the doorknob, it didn't move. The door was locked from the outside. I tried to stay calm, but fear was creeping in. I checked the windows, but they were all locked, and the bars on the outside made it impossible to break through. My heart raced as I realized I was trapped. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the walls seemed to swallow the sound. No one would hear me. Just as I was about to try breaking down the door, I heard footsteps on the other side. The doorknob turned, and Mr. Green slowly opened the door. He stood there, holding a set of keys, his expression blank. But there was something in his eyes, a coldness that made my skin crawl. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm, too calm. I tried to play it off, pretending I was looking for something outside. I mentioned that the door was locked by mistake, hoping he would just let me go. But he didn't move. Instead, he stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Why are you in such a hurry?" he asked, his tone still eerily calm. "You just moved in. There's no need to leave so soon." I felt my stomach drop. The way he said it, the way he stood there, blocking my way out, I knew then that he wasn't going to let me leave. I backed away, trying to keep some distance between us. "You've been watching me," I said, my voice shaking. "Why are there cameras in my room?" Mr. Green's smile was slow and unsettling. "You're not the first person to stay here," he said. "But nobody leaves so easily. You see, I like to keep an eye on my tenants. It's for their safety." His words sent chills down my spine. I knew I had to do something, anything, to get out of there. But he was blocking the only exit, and I was alone, trapped with a man who had been spying on me from the moment I moved in. Desperation took over. I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a lamp on the bedside table, and swung it at him. The lamp shattered as it hit his arm, and he let out a grunt of pain. But instead of backing off, he lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat. We struggled, knocking over furniture as I tried to break free. I managed to push him off me, and he stumbled backward. I saw my chance and grabbed a chair, smashing it against the window. The glass shattered, and I didn't waste a second. Ignoring the pain of the glass cutting into my hands, I climbed through the broken window, falling onto the pavement outside. I was bleeding, my hands and arms cut from the glass, but I didn't stop. I ran down the street, my heart pounding, until I saw a car approaching. I waved it down, and the driver, a young woman, stopped. She looked at me, wide-eyed, and quickly unlocked the door when she saw the state I was in. "Please," I begged, "call the police. I need help." She nodded, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. I slumped in the passenger seat, trying to catch my breath, the adrenaline still coursing through me. The police arrived within minutes, and I told them everything. They went into the house, guns drawn, but when they came back out, they didn't have Mr. Green with them. "He's gone," one of the officers said. "The room is empty too. No cameras, no furniture, nothing." I couldn't believe it. It was like he had vanished, taking everything with him. The police took my statement, but without any evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They said they would keep looking for him, but I knew the truth. He was gone, and I wasn't his first victim. I still see his face in my nightmares, that cold smile and those eyes that seemed to see right through me. I move far away, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting for his next tenant. When I first moved to the city, everything felt strange and lonely. I didn't know anyone, so my days were spent inside my new apartment. It wasn't a big place, just a small one-bedroom on the third floor of an old building. I tried to make it feel like home, but the walls still felt cold, and the emptiness made every sound echo in a way that unsettled me. Then, about a week after I settled in, I found the first bouquet of flowers at my door. They were simple, just a mix of roses and lilies. But there was a note attached. "Welcome to your new home." It didn't say who they were from. At first, I thought it might be a kind gesture from the landlord or maybe one of the neighbors, though I hadn't met any of them. I shrugged it off, put the flowers in a vase, and went about my day. The next day, another bouquet was there. This time, the note said, "I hope you're settling in well." It was odd, but again, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone was just trying to be friendly. But by the third day, when another bouquet appeared with the note, "You looked beautiful in that blue dress," I started to feel uneasy. How could someone know what I was wearing? I hadn't left my apartment that day. The flowers kept coming, and the notes became more specific, mentioning small details about my daily routine. One said, "I love how you always make coffee first thing in the morning." Another one read, "Red suits you. You should wear it more often." I checked the locks on my door and windows, convinced that someone must be watching me, but I couldn't find any sign that anyone had been inside. Still, the feeling that I was being watched grew stronger each day. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. One evening, after a particularly bad day, I received a note that said, "I love watching you sleep." My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone about the insomnia that had kept me tossing and turning the night before. The idea that someone had been close enough to see me in such a vulnerable state terrified me. That night I decided to stay up and see if I could catch whoever was doing this. I left the lights off and pretended to sleep, my heart racing with every creak of the old building. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard it, a faint noise coming from the closet. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again. A soft scraping sound like something brushing against the walls. I forced myself to get out of bed and move toward the closet, my hand shaking as I reached for the door. When I opened it, everything seemed normal. But as I stood there, I noticed something strange. One of the panels in the back of the closet was slightly loose. I pulled on it, and to my horror, it revealed a small, hidden crawl space. Inside, there was barely enough room for a person, but that wasn't what terrified me the most. What I found inside made my stomach drop. There were items that had gone missing from my apartment, small things I hadn't even realized were gone, like a pair of earrings, a book I thought I'd misplaced, and even a half-empty bottle of perfume. But the worst was a notebook filled with notes about me, every detail of my life since I had moved in, written in a handwriting that wasn't mine. My hands trembled as I realized that someone had been living in my apartment with me, watching me, and knowing everything about me. I stumbled back, dropping the notebook, and ran out of the closet, barely able to breathe. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to explain what I'd found. When they arrived, they searched the crawl space and the rest of the apartment. They found more evidence that someone had been entering through the crawl space, but the person was gone. They told me they would investigate further, but I could see in their eyes that they didn't think they'd find the person. After they left, I couldn't stay there any longer. I started packing my things, desperate to leave that place behind. But as I was about to leave, I noticed something that made my heart stop. There, on the kitchen counter, was another bouquet of flowers. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and I had locked the door after the police left. The note attached was simple but terrifying. "You can't run from me." I froze, the suitcase slipping from my hand. My mind raced, trying to understand how this could be happening. I had just found out that someone had been inside my apartment, and yet they were still here, watching me even now. The thought of staying in that apartment for one more minute was unbearable, but the idea of leaving, knowing that someone could be following me, was just as terrifying. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do next. All I knew was that no matter where I went, I would never feel safe again. I went on a camping trip with my friends last summer, thinking it would be a nice break from the city. We were four: me, Josh, Hannah, and Tom. We were looking for adventure, and the idea of spending a night deep in the woods seemed exciting at the time. I don't think any of us imagined how wrong things would go. It was late afternoon when we found the cabin. We had been hiking for hours, and when we saw it, hidden between the trees, we thought it was a lucky find. The cabin was old, with wood that looked weathered and gray. Some windows were cracked, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. It was clear no one had been there in years. But to us, it seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp for the night. Hannah was the first to suggest staying there. "It's better than sleeping in tents," she said, trying to peer through the dusty windows. Josh agreed, shrugging like it didn't matter much to him. Tom and I exchanged a glance, both feeling uneasy, but we didn't want to be the ones to back out, so we agreed. The inside was as creepy as the outside. The floor creaked with every step, and the air was damp and cold. even though it was warm outside. There were some old broken furniture pieces, a chair with a missing leg, a table covered in dust, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't seen a fire in decades. We set up our sleeping bags in the main room, close to the fireplace, hoping it would help keep us warm during the night. As night fell, we lit a fire in the fireplace. It gave the room an orange glow, but it didn't make it feel any less eerie. We tried to keep the mood light, joking around, but there was a tension in the air that none of us could ignore. I think we all felt it, even if no one said anything. The cabin wasn't just old. It felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. Then the noises started. At first, they were soft, barely noticeable. I thought it was just the wind or maybe some animals outside. But as the night went on, the sounds grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. We all heard it, but no one wanted to acknowledge it. Hannah broke the silence, trying to laugh it off. "It's probably just an animal," she said, but her voice shook. Josh, always the skeptic, agreed, though he didn't sound too sure either. Tom stood up, saying he'd check it out, but I could tell he didn't really want to. When Tom opened the door, the cold night air rushed in, making the fire flicker. We waited in silence, straining to hear anything. After a few minutes, Tom came back, looking pale. "There's nothing out there," he said, but his eyes darted around the room like he was expecting something to jump out at him. That's when I noticed the scratches on the door frame. They weren't deep, but they were fresh. Someone, or something, had been there recently. None of us slept that night. We kept hearing those footsteps circling the cabin, coming closer and then fading away. The fire started to die down, and with it, our nerves. I tried to keep my mind off the noises by talking. I don't even remember what I said, but at some point, Josh mentioned something about the cabin's history. I could hear the fear in his voice as he talked. Josh had heard rumors, something about a group of campers who went missing in these woods years ago. The police never found them. They only found the campsite, abandoned, with signs of a struggle. "Some people say it was this cabin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that they were last seen here." The realization hit us all at once. We weren't just in any cabin. We were in that cabin, the one where those campers disappeared. Panic set in, and I could see it on everyone's faces. We were all thinking the same thing. We needed to leave, but it was too dark, and we had no idea what was out there. Then, suddenly, Tom got up and said he needed some air. We didn't try to stop him. I think we all wanted to get out of that room. But after a few minutes, he didn't come back. We called out for him, first quietly, then louder, but there was no response. When Josh and I stepped outside, we found nothing. No Tom, no footprints, nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The rest of the night was a blur. I remember feeling like we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made us jump. We huddled together in the cabin, too scared to sleep, too scared to move. We waited for the sun to rise, praying that we could make it out alive. As soon as it was light enough, we grabbed our things and ran. We didn't talk. We didn't look back. We just ran until we reached the trail we had come from. We never found Tom. We reported him missing, but the search turned up nothing. It's like he disappeared off the face of the earth. I haven't talked to Josh or Hannah since that trip. I think we all want to forget what happened, but I can't. The memories keep coming back, especially at night when it's quiet. I can still hear those footsteps, still feel the cold air from the open door. I don't know what happened in that cabin, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't done with us. I never expected to hear from my brother again. It had been years since we last spoke, and our relationship was complicated to say the least. So when I saw a missed call from him on my phone, I was confused. I played the voicemail, and what I heard sent a chill down my spine. His voice was frantic, desperate. He said he was in grave danger and needed my help immediately. There was panic in his words, a fear I had never heard before. I couldn't make out everything he said, but it was enough to shake me. How could he be in danger? What happened to him? Without thinking, I called him back. The phone rang a few times before someone answered, but it wasn't my brother. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. I asked where my brother was, and the person on the line paused before saying, "Your brother has been dead for years. You must be mistaken." I felt my heart drop. Dead? That couldn't be right. I just heard his voice. I insisted that I had just received a call from him, but the person repeated that my brother was dead and that I needed to let it go. The call ended abruptly, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I didn't know what to think. It made no sense. If my brother was dead, how did I just hear his voice? And why did the person who answered sound so certain? I tried calling back again, but this time the number was disconnected. It felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't just leave it like that. I needed to know what was going on. I started searching through my brother's old social media profiles, hoping to find some clue. But everything was frozen in time, as if he had just stopped living one day. I messaged a few of our mutual friends, asking if they had heard from him recently. The responses were the same. My brother was dead, and they didn't understand why I was asking. Their certainty made me doubt my own memories, but I knew what I heard. I replayed the voicemail over and over, clinging to it as the only proof that I wasn't crazy. But something strange started happening. The voicemail became shorter each time I listened to it, like parts of it were being erased. By the fifth listen, all that was left was static. I started questioning everything. Maybe I was remembering wrong, or maybe there was something I missed. But every time I tried to think back, my memories felt blurred, like they were slipping away. I became obsessed with finding out the truth. I searched through old photos, visited places where my brother used to live, and even went through his belongings that I had stored away. But nothing gave me the answers I needed. My nights were sleepless, filled with thoughts that wouldn't stop. I started seeing his face in my dreams, always with that same look of fear. I began to wonder if I was losing touch with reality. Every clue I found only made things more confusing. Everyone around me insisted that my brother was gone, but I couldn't accept it. The voicemail was real, I was sure of it, even if it was fading from my phone. Eventually, I decided to visit his grave. It was the only place left where I might find some kind of closure. The cemetery was quiet, almost too quiet. As I approached the grave, I felt a sense of dread. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I knew that something was wrong. At the grave, I stood there, staring at the headstone with his name on it. It felt surreal, like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed someone standing a few rows away, watching me. I couldn't make out their face, but something about them felt off. They started walking towards me, and as they got closer, I realized I recognized them. The figure stopped a few feet away from me, and without a word handed me an old, weathered envelope. I opened it with shaking hands and found a letter inside. The handwriting was familiar. It was my brother's. The letter was short, only a few lines, but it confirmed what I feared the most. There were secrets in our family, dark ones, and my brother's death was part of a cover-up. The letter ended with a warning to leave this alone, or I'd end up like him. When I looked up, the figure was gone. I was alone again, standing at my brother's grave with more questions than answers. I left the cemetery feeling hollow, like a part of me had been lost there. I thought that was the end of it. But when I got home, something even stranger happened. My phone buzzed with a new voicemail. My heart raced as I saw that it was from my brother again. I hesitated before playing it, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice was even more desperate this time. He begged me to help him, saying they were coming for him and that I was the only one who could save him. But the part that terrified me the most was the timestamp on the message. It was from earlier that day, after I had visited his grave. How could that be possible? I sat there, staring at my phone, unable to move. The message kept playing in my head, my brother's voice begging me over and over again. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was I going insane? Or was something else at play? I wish I could say I found the answers, but I'm still searching. Every day I check my phone, hoping to hear from him again, hoping for some kind of explanation. But deep down, I know that whatever happened to my brother, it's not something I can understand or fix. Now, I'm left with nothing but questions and the haunting memory of his voice, calling out to me from beyond a grave that shouldn't hold him. I never thought it could happen to me. I mean, you always hear about break-ins, but it's just a story until it's your story. That day, I came home from work like any other day. My commute was normal, the same route, the same tired faces in the subway. But when I reached my front door, something was off. It was slightly open, just a crack, but enough to make my heart drop. I stood there, frozen, trying to remember if I'd left it like that. Maybe I was careless, but I never left the door open. Never. I pushed it open slowly, expecting the worst. Inside, my house was a mess. Drawers were pulled out, furniture shifted, like someone was searching for something. I rushed to check if anything valuable was gone. My laptop, jewelry, the cash I kept hidden, all still there. But then, I noticed something strange. A small piece of paper on my coffee table, neatly placed as if meant to be found. It had a few words on it, but they made no sense to me. "Do you remember the park?" it read. The park? Which park? My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. I picked up the note, turning it over, but there was nothing else. Confused and scared, I searched the house for more. I found 2 more notes, each one with a short, cryptic message. One in my kitchen drawer said, "You used to play here." The other in my bedroom closet simply said, "It's time to remember." The messages were strange, but what scared me most was how they seemed personal, like the intruder knew me. I should have called the police, I know, but something about those notes made me hesitate. It was like they were meant for me, and only me. That night, I barely slept. The next day, instead of going to work, I started following the clues. I felt like I had no choice. The first note mentioned a park, so I visited the park I used to go to as a child. I hadn't been there in years. As I walked through the old paths, I felt a chill run down my spine. Memories started to come back, but they were fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream. Near the playground, I found another note taped to a bench. It was a photo of me as a child, playing in that very park. But there was something off about it. The photo looked recent, like it was printed just days ago, even though it showed a scene from years ago. Who could have taken it? And why now? The next clue led me to my old school. The building was the same, but I felt like a stranger there. I hadn't thought about this place in so long. As I walked through the empty halls, I felt someone was watching me. My heart was pounding, and I kept looking over my shoulder. Finally, I found another note. This one inside my old locker. It had a single word: remember. But remember what? I couldn't piece it together. But the notes kept coming, leading me further down this terrifying path. They took me to places I'd long forgotten. An abandoned playground, my childhood home, Each location brought back memories I'd buried deep, things I didn't want to remember. The memories were dark, filled with fear and pain. It was like peeling back layers of my own mind, uncovering things I'd rather leave hidden. I started to realize that someone was forcing me to confront my past, to remember things I'd tried to forget. Then came the final note. It led me to a secluded, abandoned building on the outskirts of town, the kind of place no one goes to anymore. My hands shook as I pushed open the heavy door. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating. In the center of the room, there was a chair, and in that chair sat a person. As I approached, I felt a wave of nausea. The person looked familiar, too familiar. When they finally looked up, I felt the ground shift beneath me. It was my uncle, someone I hadn't seen in years, someone I had trusted. "Do you remember now?" he asked, his voice cold and detached. It all came flooding back, things I had blocked out for years. The way he used to come into my room late at night, the things he said, the things he did. I had buried those memories so deep, but he had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to make me remember. He had orchestrated everything, from the break-in to the notes. He wanted me to confront the past, to face him again. But why? What did he want from me? "I needed you to remember," he said, answering my unspoken question. "I needed you to see the truth, to understand what really happened." But his words didn't make sense. My memories, twisted and unclear, made me doubt everything. Was he telling the truth, or was this some sick game? I couldn't tell what was real anymore. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. Then he stood up and walked toward me. I backed away, fear gripping me. "Don't come any closer," I whispered, my voice shaking. But he kept coming, a twisted smile on his face. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. The world started to blur, and I felt like I was falling, losing myself in the chaos of my own mind. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my house. The notes were gone. The house was in order, like nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't just a dream. The memories were too real, too vivid. But now, I don't know what's real and what's not. Was he really there? Did I really confront him, or was it all in my head? The questions haunt me, and I can't escape the feeling that someone is still watching me, waiting for me to remember more. I was cleaning out the attic of my old house when I found the journal. It was hidden under a pile of old newspapers, dusty and forgotten. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I almost put it aside, thinking it was just another piece of junk, but something made me open it. The first few pages were innocent enough, just notes about the weather, some thoughts about life. But as I flipped through the pages, I noticed the tone changed. The entries started to describe strange, violent events, murders that had happened years ago in my town. The writing was detailed, almost too detailed, like the writer had been there, watching everything. At first, I thought it was fiction, just some sick story someone had made up. But the more I read, the more I realized these weren't just stories. The dates and locations matched real events, real crimes that had never been solved. I knew because I had grown up hearing about them. Those old, cold cases that everyone whispered about, but no one really understood. The first entry that really got to me was about a woman who had been found in her home, strangled with a piece of rope. The journal described how the killer had watched her for weeks, learning her routine, waiting for the perfect moment. I could almost see the scene in my mind, the way the writer described it. And when I checked online, I found the exact same case from 30 years ago, same details, same victim. That's when I started to panic. There had been another murder just last week, only a few blocks from my house. A man was found in his car, his throat slit. The police had no leads. But as I read more of the journal, I found an entry that matched almost perfectly. The method, the location, even the way the writer described the victim's habits. It was all there, written years before it happened. I couldn't stop reading after that. I spent nights poring over the journal, comparing the entries to old news articles and recent reports. It was like I was obsessed, like I had to know how it all connected. I barely slept, barely ate. I stopped answering calls from my friends, ignored texts from my family. All I could think about was the journal and the murders. And the more I read, the more I started to feel like the journal was trying to tell me something, like the writer knew more than just what had happened. The entries became more detailed, more personal. The writer described the victims with such intimacy, as if they had known them, maybe even loved them. I began to suspect that the journal might belong to someone I knew. There was a familiarity in the way things were written, little phrases that sounded like something I'd heard before. But the idea that someone I knew could have been involved in those murders, no, it was too much. I didn't want to believe it. Then I found an entry that wasn't like the others. It wasn't about an old murder, something that had already happened. It was about a murder that hadn't happened yet, but the writer had planned it in such detail, like it was just another thing to cross off a list. The date was set for the next weekend. The location was a house not far from mine, and the victim? It was someone I knew. Someone I cared about. I tried to warn them, tried to tell them what I had found, but they looked at me like I was crazy. And maybe I was, because how could I explain that I had found an old journal that predicted murders, including one that was supposed to happen in just a few days? They didn't believe me, of course. They thought I was joking, or worse, losing my mind. But I couldn't let it go. I stayed up all night, trying to think of what to do, how to stop what was coming. I went over the entry again and again, trying to find some clue, something I could use. But all I found was fear, a creeping sense of dread that I couldn't shake. The next day, I found a new entry in the journal. It wasn't written in the same old handwriting. This one was fresher, the ink still dark and clean. But what really scared me was that the handwriting, it looked like mine. The entry described a murder, another one. And this time, it was so close to home that it made my skin crawl. It described me, my own actions, like I had done it myself, but I hadn't. At least, I didn't think I had. I couldn't remember doing anything like that. I tried to tell myself it was impossible, that I was just tired, just imagining things. But the more I tried to convince myself, the less sure I became. I started to question everything, my memories, my thoughts, even my own sanity. Had I been the one all along? Was this journal mine? Had I somehow blocked out what I had done, only to find it again, like some twisted version of myself was trying to tell me the truth? I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that the journal wasn't just a collection of old stories. It was something darker, something that had taken hold of me and wouldn't let go. And as much as I wanted to burn it, to get rid of it forever, I couldn't. Because deep down, I was afraid of what I might find next, what other secrets it might reveal. And even now, as I write this, I can't help but glance at the journal, sitting there on my desk, waiting for me to open it again, to see what happens next. But I'm afraid that the next entry I find will be the last, afraid that it will be about me. The final cabin. I thought this trip would help me unwind. After months of working long hours, I finally decided to book a cabin in the woods. The place I found on Craigslist looked perfect. It was far from the city, surrounded by trees, and there was even a small lake nearby. The photos showed a cozy little cabin with a porch where you could sit and relax. The owner, who only gave the name R, had good reviews from other guests. They all said the same thing. The cabin was peaceful, quiet, and felt like home. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was the quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. The cabin looked just like the pictures, but something didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to move among the trees, or how the air felt thick, as if it was holding its breath. I told myself it was just nerves. I wasn't used to being alone in such a remote place. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. There was a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and one bedroom. The first night was uneventful, though I woke up a few times thinking I heard noises. It sounded like someone walking on the porch, but when I looked, no one was there. I convinced myself it was just the wood creaking, or maybe an animal passing by. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By the second day, I started to notice small things out of place. I'd leave a book on the table, only to find it on the floor later. Doors I knew I had closed would be slightly open. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful, but it kept happening. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see someone staring back at me. But there was never anyone there, just the empty woods and the reflection of my own face in the glass. That evening, as I was making dinner, I heard the front door creak open. My heart started pounding as I walked slowly towards it. The door was open, swinging slightly like someone had just pushed it. I called out, but no one answered. I stepped outside, scanning the area. The forest was still, the trees casting long, dark shadows in the fading light. I closed the door, making sure it was locked, and went back to the kitchen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Later that night, as I sat by the fireplace, I heard footsteps again. This time, they were clear, slow, and deliberate. They stopped right outside the door. I froze, my heart racing, my body tense. The door creaked open, and I saw a figure standing there. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It stepped inside, moving slowly, almost like it was in a trance. In the dim light, I could see it was a man, tall and broad, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't say a word, just stood there, watching me. Fear took over. I ran to the bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I was completely isolated. The footsteps came closer, stopping just outside the bedroom door. Then there was a soft knocking, almost polite. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The door handle rattled, but the lock held. After a moment, the knocking stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence. I stayed in the bedroom all night, too scared to sleep. I held a heavy lamp, ready to use it as a weapon if I had to. The footsteps didn't return, and eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the curtains, and everything seemed normal again. But the bedroom door was wide open, and there were muddy footprints leading from the entrance to the bed where I had been sleeping. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things as fast as I could, my hands still shaking with fear. As I was leaving, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small camera, barely visible, hidden in the corner of the living room. My stomach dropped. Had someone been watching me the entire time? Is that how they knew when I was alone and vulnerable? I didn't look back as I drove away, the cabin disappearing in my rearview mirror. But the feeling of being watched has never left me. Even now, back in my own home, I can't shake the sense that someone is still out there, waiting, watching. Sometimes, late at night, I hear those same slow, deliberate footsteps outside my door. And every time, my heart stops, wondering if this time they'll come inside. I never thought much about the weird stuff happening in my life until it was too late. It all started with a text, something I'd usually ignore, but this one caught my attention. The message was sent late at night, around midnight, just when I had settled into bed. It said, "Nice blue shirt." I was wearing a blue shirt that day. I figured it was just a friend messing around, but still, it felt off. How did they know what I was wearing? The next day, I asked my friends if they had sent the text, but no one admitted to it. They all laughed, telling me I was being paranoid. So, I brushed it off, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe someone saw me earlier and decided to be creepy. But that was just the beginning. The next night I got another message. "Enjoying your tea?" I froze. I had just made myself a cup of tea and was sitting on the couch reading a book. I looked around, trying to see if anyone was outside, but my curtains were closed. The thought of someone watching me made my skin crawl. I checked the locks on my doors and windows before going to bed, hoping it was just a coincidence. But it wasn't. The messages kept coming, each one more specific than the last. "Why do you leave the light on in the hallway?" That one came while I was brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My heart pounded as I turned off the light in the hallway. I tried to laugh it off, but the truth was, I was scared. I didn't know who was sending these texts, or how they knew exactly what I was doing. I started to feel like I was being watched all the time. I couldn't focus at work, and I was constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to find someone lurking in the shadows. I didn't tell anyone because I thought they wouldn't believe me, or worse, they'd think I was losing my mind. One night, after another unsettling message, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The text had said, "You look tired." I hadn't left the house all day, so how did they know? I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and started searching my apartment. Room by room, I checked every corner, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. I went back to the living room, my heart still racing. My phone buzzed again. "You missed a spot." The text made me drop the knife. I was trembling as I stared at my phone. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Whoever was doing this wasn't just watching me from outside. They were in the house. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to run, but where? The thought of facing the intruder was terrifying, but staying put wasn't an option either. I grabbed the knife again and crept through the apartment, my breath shaky and shallow. The phone buzzed in my hand, another message lighting up the screen. Getting closer. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The hallway felt longer than usual, the shadows darker, more threatening. I held my breath as I approached the bedroom door, the last place I hadn't checked. I reached for the doorknob, but then I stopped. My phone buzzed again. "Behind you." I spun around, swinging the knife wildly, but there was nothing. No one. I was panting, the terror building up inside me like a pressure cooker about to explode. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the darkness swallowing me whole. Then, another buzz. "Come to the bedroom." My hand shook as I pushed open the bedroom door. The lights flicked on by themselves, and there, in the corner, stood a figure. It took me a second to recognize them. It was someone I knew, someone I trusted, my brother. He was the last person I expected to see there. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me with a blank expression. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was he here? How long had he been here? I opened my mouth to ask, but the words wouldn't come out. My brother took a step forward, and I instinctively raised the knife. His expression didn't change, and for a moment, I wondered if this was all some sick joke, but then he smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that sent chills down my spine. He reached out to me, and I stumbled back, hitting the wall. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a joke. This was real. Before I could react, he lunged at me. The next few moments were a blur of movement, fear, and pain. I don't remember how it ended, but when I came to, I was on the floor, the knife in my hand, covered in blood. My brother lay next to me, motionless. I stared at him, trying to process what had just happened. The room was silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I couldn't believe what I had done, what he had made me do. I dropped the knife, my hands shaking uncontrollably. As I sat there in the middle of the room, my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I picked it up and read the message, my blood running cold. Well done. I wasn't planning to stay late again, but the deadline was tomorrow, and I couldn't afford another screw-up. The office was empty, the usual hum of activity replaced by an unsettling quiet. It wasn't the first time I worked this late, but tonight felt different. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I told myself I was just tired. That's what happens when you're the last one in the office, right? Your mind plays tricks on you. I shook it off and focused on the project in front of me, the glow of my computer screen the only light in the room. The clock on the wall ticked, louder than usual. Time seemed to crawl. Then I heard it. A faint noise from above. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just the old pipes settling, or maybe the wind rattling the windows. But the sound came again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the ceiling. I stopped typing, my fingers frozen on the keyboard. Who could be up there this late? It's probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe the cleaning crew, even though I hadn't seen them in hours. But the footsteps didn't sound like cleaning. They were too heavy, too measured. They didn't match the rhythm of someone going about their work. And then there was something else, a dragging noise, like someone pulling something across the floor. I tried to ignore it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't focus anymore. My eyes kept darting to the ceiling, my ears straining to catch every sound. The noises became more distinct, footsteps, dragging, and something else. Was that whispering? It was so faint I couldn't be sure, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was up there. I needed to know what was going on. Maybe if I saw it was nothing, I could relax and get back to work. I grabbed my phone and walked to the elevator, the sound of my own footsteps too loud in the silence. The elevator ride felt like it took forever, the doors creaking open on the floor above. The lights flickered as I stepped out, casting long, eerie shadows down the hallway. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely hear anything over the blood rushing in my ears. I moved slowly, trying to be quiet, listening for any sign of movement. The office was a mess. Papers were scattered everywhere, desks overturned, chairs knocked over. It looked like there had been a struggle. My breath caught in my throat. Something bad had happened here. But when? And why hadn't I heard about it? I walked further down the hall, my eyes scanning the floor for any clues. That's when I saw it. A nameplate lying among the debris. The name on it was familiar, but not in a good way. It was the name of a guy who used to work here, someone who had disappeared without a trace a few years ago. There had been rumors, of course, but nothing concrete. People just said he left one day and never came back. The noises I had heard earlier, the footsteps, the dragging, matched the timeline of his last night here. My stomach turned as I pieced it together. Had he been trying to leave? Had something, no, someone, stopped him? My hands were shaking as I picked up the nameplate. This wasn't just some coincidence. I knew it wasn't. I had to find out more, but every instinct told me to run, to get out of this building and never look back. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I found a drawer that had been pulled open, its contents spilled across the floor. Among the papers was a notebook, the pages filled with frantic, barely legible writing. It was his, the missing guy's. As I read, my heart raced faster. He wrote about strange noises, just like I had heard tonight, about feeling watched, hunted, even in the supposed safety of the office. He knew someone was after him, but he didn't know who or why. The last entry was cut off mid-sentence, ending in a scrawl that looked more like a scream than a word. My breath came in short gasps as I realized what this meant. He hadn't left voluntarily. He had been taken, or worse. I was so absorbed in the notebook that I didn't hear the noises until they were too close. The footsteps, the dragging, they were right outside the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I dropped the notebook and scrambled to my feet. I had to get out of here, now. I bolted down the hall, my mind racing with fear. The elevator was too far. I'd never make it. I ran for the stairs, but as I reached for the door, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panic surged through me. I spun around, searching for another way out, but the hallway was empty. Too empty. The footsteps were closer now. I could hear them clearly, along with the sound of something heavy being dragged along the floor. My breath hitched as I realized there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I was trapped. I backed away, my eyes darting around for anything I could use to defend myself. But all I had was my phone, which was useless in my shaking hands. I tried to call for help, but the screen was dead. No signal, no power, nothing. I was alone. The footsteps stopped just outside the door to the office where I was hiding. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, praying whoever or whatever was out there wouldn't find me. But then I heard it. The sound of breathing, slow and heavy, right behind me. I turned around, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. But there was nothing there. Just the empty room and the darkness closing in around me. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, if the stress had finally pushed me over the edge. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the cold, clammy hand that clamped down on my shoulder, pulling me back into the darkness. I never saw who or what it was. But I know I'll never leave this building, just like the guy before me. If anyone finds this, don't stay late. Don't investigate the noises. Just leave, while you still can. We never checked in. Last summer, my girlfriend and I decided to take a road trip. We wanted to escape from our busy lives, just the two of us, driving without a plan. It was supposed to be simple, a relaxing break from everything. We didn't have any specific destination in mind, just a general idea of driving until we were tired, finding a motel, and getting some rest. It was late when we saw the motel sign glowing in the distance, the kind you see in old movies. The sign flickered as we pulled in, and the place looked almost abandoned. There were only a few cars in the parking lot, scattered and far from each other. The building was old, the paint peeling, but we were exhausted. We decided to stay the night. Inside, the lobby was just as empty as the parking lot. The only sound was the quiet hum of a fan somewhere behind the desk. The man at the counter barely looked up when we entered. He was old with gray hair and a wrinkled face that showed no interest in us. It felt strange, but we were too tired to care. We checked in, paid in cash because the card machine was broken, and he handed us a key. Room 8. The room was small, but it had a bed and a bathroom. That was all we needed. We locked the door, dropped our bags, and fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, I woke up to an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl, where you feel like something is wrong even if you can't say what it is. My girlfriend was still asleep, so I quietly got up and went to the window. The parking lot was empty, completely empty. Our car was gone. I woke her up, trying not to panic. We dressed quickly and hurried outside, hoping we just missed something. Maybe we had parked somewhere else? Maybe someone moved the car? But no, it was definitely gone. And the strangest thing, every room's door was open, wide open, like the place had been abandoned in a rush. But there was no one else around. We ran to the lobby, expecting to find the old man at the desk, but it was empty. The fan was still humming, but no one was there. We called out, but there was no answer. My girlfriend started to freak out, and I didn't know what to do. We were alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no car and no way to leave. Finally, the man appeared, coming from a back room. He looked at us like we were strangers, like he didn't recognize us. When we asked about our car, he seemed confused. He said we had never checked in, that he had never seen us before. I showed him the key, but there was no number on it, nothing to prove we had stayed there. I could feel the tension building in the air. My girlfriend was on the verge of tears, and I was trying to stay calm, but it felt like we were trapped. The man's expression changed, becoming colder, almost threatening. He told us we should leave now, while we still could. Without a car, we had no choice but to start walking. We didn't know where we were going, just away from that motel. As we were leaving, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Our car, hidden behind an old shed at the edge of the property. We ran to it, but it wasn't right. The tires were slashed, and the keys were gone. It felt like someone had gone out of their way to keep us from leaving. Then, I saw him. The motel owner, standing just a little way off, watching us. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stared. There was something in his eyes, something that made me realize this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. He knew we wouldn't get far. He had done this before. We were desperate. We needed to get out of there. We searched the shed, hoping to find something to help us. There were some old tools, enough to patch up the car, just enough to drive. We worked quickly, every sound making us jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him, or worse, someone else, coming to stop us. Finally, we got the car moving, slowly, but it was enough. As we drove away, I looked back, expecting to see the motel in the rearview mirror, but it was gone. There was nothing there, just an overgrown lot with no sign that a building had ever been there. We didn't speak as we drove, both of us too shaken to say anything. We just wanted to get as far away as possible, to forget about what had happened. But then, the radio crackled to life. It was just static at first, but then I heard it, his voice, clear as day. "You forgot to check out." That was the last straw. We sped up, not caring about the condition of the car or where we were going, just needing to get away from that voice. We haven't talked about it since. We pretend it never happened, but I can't forget. I don't know what that place was, or what would have happened if we hadn't gotten out when we did. All I know is that I'm never going on another road trip again. Last night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. It was one of those moments when you're not sure if you're really awake or still dreaming, but the sound was too real. My first thought was that it was my dog, Luna. She often nudged the door open when she wanted to come in and sleep by my bed. I turned over, still half asleep, and called out softly to her, but instead of the familiar jingle of her collar or the patter of paws on the floor, I heard a man's voice. Low and calm, it answered from the darkness. "I'm not Luna." My heart stopped. I froze, my mind trying to catch up with what was happening. This wasn't a dream. Someone was in my room. The room was pitch black, the kind of darkness that made everything blur into shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process the situation. The voice had come from near the door, but I couldn't see anything. My bed felt like the only safe place, but I knew I couldn't stay there. My phone was on the nightstand, just inches away, but even moving my arm felt impossible. I finally forced myself to reach for it, trying to be as quiet as possible. My fingers fumbled for the phone, but I accidentally knocked it to the floor. The sound seemed to echo in the silence, and my stomach dropped. The voice spoke again, closer this time. "Looking for something?" Panic surged through me. I had to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't listen. My mind was screaming at me to get up, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. How long had he been in my house? How did he get in? My thoughts raced, trying to find an answer, trying to understand how this nightmare had become real. Then I remembered. I always locked my bedroom door before going to bed. I did it without thinking, a habit. But now the door was open, and the only way it could be was if someone had unlocked it. My skin crawled with the realization. This man had been in my house long enough to find my keys, or worse, he already had a key. I had to get out of there. I knew I couldn't stay in bed, hoping he would just go away. I slowly pushed the covers off, trying to keep quiet, but every sound seemed amplified, like it was betraying me. The mattress creaked as I shifted my weight, and I winced, terrified that he would hear. I stood up, the floor cold under my feet, and slowly moved toward the door. I didn't dare look into the darkness, afraid of what I might see. My only thought was to get out, to run, to find help. But each step I took seemed to take forever, the silence around me thick and heavy. He spoke again, his voice mocking. "Where do you think you're going?" I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. He was close, too close. I could feel his presence behind me, but I couldn't see him. It was like he was playing a game with me, enjoying my fear. I wanted to scream, but I knew that wouldn't help. I had to stay calm, had to keep moving. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle. But it wouldn't turn. It was locked, from the outside. My mind blanked for a second, not understanding. Then it hit me. He had locked me in. My panic turned to desperation. I pulled at the door, yanking it with all my strength, but it didn't budge. I could hear him behind me, his breathing now close enough that I could feel it on my neck. I was trapped. I spun around, pressing my back against the door, my eyes straining to see him in the darkness. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive blackness. I felt like I was drowning in it, my fear choking me, making it hard to think, to breathe. And then he was there, right in front of me. I could barely make out his shape, but I could feel his presence, feel the coldness that seemed to radiate from him. I wanted to fight, to push him away, but my body wouldn't move. It was like my mind had given up, accepting that there was no way out. He leaned in, his voice a whisper now. "You shouldn't have left the door unlocked." His words sent a chill down my spine. How did he know that? How could he have known I sometimes forgot to lock the front door when I was tired, just wanting to get to bed? My stomach turned, and I realized with horror that he had been watching me, maybe for days, maybe longer. I don't remember what happened next. Everything became a blur. I must have blacked out, or maybe my mind just refused to remember. When I came to, the room was empty. The door was open, and there was no sign of him. But I knew he had been there. I could still feel his presence, like a shadow lingering in the corners of the room. I never heard from him again, but I moved out the next day, left everything behind. I didn't tell anyone the full story, just that I didn't feel safe there anymore. I can't stay in one place for long now, always moving, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for that voice in the dark to find me again. I was on my way back from a long business trip. I was exhausted, and all I could think about was getting home, taking a shower, and collapsing into my bed. The airport was crowded, as usual, with people rushing around, eager to get to their destinations. When my luggage finally came down the conveyor belt, I grabbed it without much thought. It was a black suitcase, like 1,000 others, but I was sure it was mine. I didn't even check the tag. I just wanted to get out of there. When I got home, I tossed the suitcase on the bed and went straight to the shower. I stood under the hot water for a long time, letting the stress of the trip wash away. Afterward, I finally felt relaxed and ready to unpack. That's when things started to go wrong. I unzipped the suitcase, expecting to see my clothes neatly folded on top. Instead, I found a pile of photographs. My first thought was that I'd picked up someone else's bag by mistake. But then I started to look at the photos, and my heart nearly stopped. The pictures were of people in their homes, at work, even asleep in their beds. All of them were taken without the people knowing, like someone had been stalking them. I felt sick. I shuffled through the photos with shaking hands, and that's when I saw it. There, mixed in with all the other pictures, was a photo of me. It was taken from a distance, but it was unmistakably me, walking into my apartment building. I dropped the photo and it fluttered to the floor. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that someone had mixed up their bags, and I was just unlucky enough to be the one who picked it up. But then I found the list. It was a plain piece of paper with a list of names, and at the very top, written in bold letters, was my name. Below mine were others, names I didn't recognize, but that didn't matter. The fact that my name was on that list terrified me more than anything. My mind raced with questions. Who was watching me? Why was my name on this list? And what was going to happen next? I started to feel like I was being watched, even in the safety of my own home. Every noise outside made me jump. I checked the locks on my doors and windows, even though I knew it wouldn't help. Whoever had been following me knew where I lived. They had been close enough to take photos of me. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. On my way to work, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching me. At work, I couldn't concentrate. My boss noticed and asked if I was okay, but I couldn't tell him the truth. How could I explain what was happening without sounding crazy? At night, I barely slept. Every creak in the house made me bolt upright in bed, my heart racing. I started to think about going to the police, but something held me back. What if they didn't believe me? Worse, what if whoever was following me found out and decided to take action? A week after I found the photos, I finally decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to do something. I packed the suitcase back up and headed for the airport, hoping to return it and forget this nightmare ever happened. But as I was about to leave my apartment, I noticed a figure standing across the street, half hidden in the shadows. They were watching me. I was sure of it. I froze, panic flooding my body. Should I still go to the airport? Or was that exactly what they wanted? My hands were trembling as I locked my door and headed out. I tried to act normal, like I didn't see the figure, but my mind was screaming at me to run. I got to the airport and started looking for a place to drop off the suitcase. Maybe I could just leave it somewhere and walk away. But before I could decide, someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around and there was a man standing behind me. He looked ordinary, dressed in a plain jacket and jeans. but something about him made my skin crawl. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you have my bag," he said, his voice calm and polite. I nodded, too afraid to speak, and handed him the suitcase. He took it from me without a word, but as he turned to leave, he slipped a piece of paper into my hand. I was too shocked to react. I just stood there, frozen, as he walked away. When I finally looked down at the paper, my heart sank. It was a simple, handwritten note with just 3 words: "You can't run." I dropped the note like it was on fire, my heart racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something, but all I could do was stand there, trembling. I knew in that moment that there was no escaping this. Whoever had been watching me knew everything about me. They knew where I lived, where I worked, and they had been close enough to slip me this note without anyone noticing. I don't remember how I got home. Everything after that is a blur. But I do remember the feeling of dread that settled in my stomach as I reached my front door. I unlocked it slowly, half expecting someone to be waiting for me inside. The apartment was empty, but it didn't feel safe anymore. As I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to make sense of everything, I heard a knock at the door. My heart stopped. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knock came again, louder this time, and then a voice, low and threatening, called my name. I knew, in that moment, that they had found me, and there was no running away. The story ends here because I don't know what happened next. The last thing I remember is the door slowly creaking open, and then nothing. Maybe I'm still here, trapped in this nightmare, or maybe I'm already gone. But if you're reading this, please be careful. They're out there, and they're watching. I'm not sure if I should even be sharing this, but I need to get it out of my head. It happened last week, and I still can't stop thinking about it. I feel like every time I close my eyes, I'm right back there, in that empty street, with those footsteps behind me. I work late shifts at a small cafe in the quieter part of town. It's not the safest area, but I've been walking home from there for over a year, and nothing bad ever happened. I've always been careful, sticking to well-lit streets and avoiding shortcuts. But that night, something was different. It was just after midnight when I finally closed up the cafe. The streets were empty, quieter than usual. Normally, there's at least a couple of cars passing by or someone walking their dog. But that night, it felt like the city was holding its breath. I started my usual route home. The first few blocks were fine, but as I reached the corner of the next street, I felt it. You know that feeling when you just know someone is watching you? It's like a cold touch on the back of your neck. I shook it off, thinking I was just tired, but then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just another late-night worker heading home, like me. But the steps were slow, deliberate, matching my pace exactly. My heart started to race. I sped up just a little to see if they would do the same. They did. I took a sharp turn down a side street, hoping to lose whoever it was. But as soon as I did, I realized my mistake. This street was darker, quieter. All the shops were closed, their windows dark. The footsteps behind me quickened, just like mine. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel them getting closer. Panic started to set in. I couldn't think straight. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I knew I should head back to the main road, but every time I thought about turning around, I felt frozen, like my legs wouldn't listen. So I kept moving forward even though I knew I was going the wrong way. I took another turn, this time down an alley. I knew it was a bad idea, but at that moment, it felt like my only option. The alley was narrow and dark, the kind where the streetlights don't reach. My footsteps echoed against the walls, but so did the ones behind me. No matter how fast I walked, I couldn't shake them. I started to run. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, louder than anything else. But the footsteps behind me never slowed. They followed me, relentless, like they were glued to my shadow. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few minutes. I was too scared to look back, too scared to stop. I thought about screaming, but my throat was dry, and I didn't want to draw more attention to myself. I just wanted to get away, to find somewhere safe. Then I saw it, the dead end. A high brick wall blocked my path. There was no way around it, no doors, no windows. I was trapped. I spun around, my back against the wall. The figure was standing just a few feet away. They had stopped when I did, their face hidden in the shadows. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and calculating. "Why are you following me?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. They just stood there, like they were waiting for something. Then, in a low, almost whispering voice, they spoke my name. Hearing my name from that stranger's mouth sent a shock through my body. How did they know who I was? I tried to remember if I had seen them before, but my mind was a blur. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and I couldn't move, couldn't think. As they stepped closer into the dim light, I saw their face, and that's when I realized why they seemed so familiar. It was someone from my past, someone I thought I'd never see again. My heart dropped into my stomach, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I can't tell you everything that happened after that, because I don't really remember. I think I blacked out, or maybe my mind just won't let me recall it. But I know that when I came to, I was alone. The figure was gone, and I was lying on the cold ground, trembling and soaked in sweat. I managed to pull myself up and find my way back to the main road. I called a cab and went straight home. I haven't told anyone about this, not even my friends. I'm too scared they won't believe me, or that they'll think I'm crazy. But I know what I saw. I know who I saw. I don't know what they want from me, or why they were following me that night. But I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. And the worst part is, I have no idea when they'll come back. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never walk home alone at night again. I took the job as a night guard at the storage facility because I needed extra money. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but I had bills to pay. The job seemed simple enough. Just sit in a small office, watch the security monitors, and make sure nobody was breaking in. The place was mostly quiet at night. Rows of storage units, all locked up tight, with only the occasional car driving by on the road outside. I was told to stay alert, but after a few shifts, I got used to the silence. It felt like nothing ever happened there. The first few nights were uneventful, just me and the cold glow of the monitors. My boss had warned me to take the job seriously, but it was hard not to get a little bored. The most exciting thing was when a raccoon knocked over a trash can outside. But then, on the fourth night, I heard something. It started as a faint noise, like a distant scream. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind or maybe some kids messing around. But the sound didn't stop. It got louder, and there was a banging noise too, coming from one of the units. At first, I thought maybe it was a prank. The idea of someone hiding inside a storage unit seemed ridiculous, but the noise kept going. It sounded desperate, like someone was really in trouble. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to check it out. As I walked through the rows of units, the sounds became clearer. There was definitely someone screaming and banging on one of the metal doors. When I got closer, The banging suddenly stopped, and I heard a weak voice calling out for help. My heart was racing as I found the right unit. It was locked with a heavy padlock, just like all the others. But through the small gaps, I could hear a woman's voice. She sounded terrified, saying she'd been trapped inside for years and begging me to let her out. I didn't know what to do. I stood there for a moment, trying to think. How could someone be trapped in a storage unit for years? It didn't make any sense. But the woman's voice was so full of fear, and I could hear her crying. I couldn't just leave her there. I hesitated, thinking maybe this was a setup, but in the end, I couldn't ignore her pleas. I found a bolt cutter in the storage facility's office and went back to the unit. My hands were shaking as I cut through the padlock. When I opened the door, I couldn't believe what I saw. The woman inside looked terrible. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and she was so thin, like she hadn't eaten in a long time. Her eyes were wild, full of desperation. She kept saying she'd been locked in there for years, but that couldn't be true. I had checked the logbook, and this unit was only rented a few months ago. I tried to talk to her, to calm her down and figure out what was going on, but she wasn't making any sense. She kept saying the owner of the storage facility had locked her in there, that he was responsible for everything. But the owner was an old man, someone I couldn't imagine doing something like this. The more she talked, the more confused I became. Her story was all over the place, and I started to doubt everything I was hearing. Was she lying to me, or was she just too traumatized to tell the truth? I decided I needed to call for help, but as I reached for my phone, she suddenly lunged at me. She grabbed a piece of metal from the floor and started swinging it at me. I stumbled back, trying to defend myself, but she was fast, and I was caught off guard. The look in her eyes had changed from fear to something else, something dangerous. She was attacking me like a wild animal, and I realized too late that I had made a terrible mistake. In those last moments, as she overpowered me, I understood something. The woman wasn't supposed to leave that unit. She had been put there for a reason, and now, because of me, she was free. The thought hit me hard as I felt the sharp pain in my side. I had been so focused on helping her that I didn't see the real danger. As I lay there, bleeding out on the cold concrete floor, I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. Had the owner really locked her away? Or was there something else going on, something I would never understand? The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of her footsteps walking away into the night, leaving me alone to die in the silence of the storage facility.